Today, we're going to explore three pivotal moments in recording history, which will take us all the way from the first electric recordings to the DAWs that we still use now. Now, I'm not an expert in the history of recording. That's why I've got some clips from a video where I went and interviewed an expert in recording history. But I am learning more every year, and I'll try to give you a well-rounded idea of who played parts in each of these developments. As you'll see in a moment, different research groups across the world were trying to research different parts of audio recording and playback. And of course, the world is a complicated place where people could discover things at the same time. They could discover things through geopolitical conflicts, and it's a whole big story that we're going to get into. The first thing I want to just set the stage, though, and somebody mentioned earlier using a wax cylinder. So that's pretty much one of the most rudimentary types of recording that there ever was. And you can imagine a big horn that funneled sound down from a big opening. The musician would put sound and acoustic power into that, and that would funnel down into a stylus or a recording head that would actually create grooves on the outside of a cylinder made of wax. And that was used for a good amount of time, but there was a big pivotal moment that actually predates the first one we're going to talk about here, where we went from cylinders to discs. And what that allowed us to do was more easily distribute those recordings. And now, even when we were using discs, we were still using that horn that would funnel the acoustic power down and into the wax, and that still required things to be extremely loud at the input of the horn. And so therefore, recording really subtle things like subtle piano or subtle acoustic guitar or even spoken word or voices, it wasn't so easy because a lot of acoustical power would be required to create enough movement that would create a usable signal, basically, on that wax. So the first thing we're going to talk about here is when we transitioned from the horn style microphone, let's call it, to actually the condenser microphone. Of course, ribbon microphones and carbon microphones, those concepts were already present around this time, but the condenser microphone was particularly useful because it allowed engineers to pick up really subtle sounds due to the increased sensitivity of a condenser microphone. I could sit here and try to explain it, but I think a video that I did with Nicholas Berg over in Burbank, California, he has a company called Endpoint Audio, and he's got an amazing collection of some of the oldest gear. So let's take a look at how he explains this pivotal moment in recording history. Hey, we're here at Endpoint Audio in Burbank, California. I'm with Nicholas Berg, a restoration and preservation engineer. This place is like a museum. There's a lot of history here. We want to really focus in on these two devices right here, which actually were a part of a huge transition in the audio industry. Can you tell us what we're looking at here?
Yeah, so for the first 3 decades almost of sound recording history, it was all acoustic recording, so completely mechanical. So the microphone, in a sense, was the horn, and so you would sing and play into the horn. Just the energy of the sound itself is enough to move a small glass or mica diaphragm, and attached to that would be a stylus to cut the groove.
And what are we cutting a groove into?
A wax.
Wow, okay,
Yeah.
So it's like a wax platter or disc.
Exactly, yeah. So because it was used for so long, it started off very crude, you can imagine, but after the decades, it became very sophisticated. So they would, change the thickness of the glass. So instead of changing a microphone, they would change the size of the horn, change the thickness of the glass, change the size of the glass. They could add a couple horns together via just a little piece of plumbing. So you could have a vocal on one horn and a band on a bigger horn. And so they really spent a lot of time perfecting this technology.
Wow. And then we'll get back to more details about how this worked, but tell us what this is right here.
All the early machines, the disc machines, are like this. They're weight driven. So you can see on this one here, the weight is what powers it. So the transition between acoustic and electric didn't involve a change of the lathe itself. They use the exact same lathes, and all they did was change what was attached to the lathe. So instead of the acoustic head, they put this electric head instead. And this was a development by Bell Labs and Western Electric. And so when the studios updated between acoustic and electric, they got the new cutting head they attached to their old gear. They got this first condenser microphone, and then this rack here, which is the original recording rack.
Wow. And when you're saying first, original, these aren't models. This is
this is the real thing,
yeah.
There's often confusion about the first microphone because it was essentially just built in the hobby shop there. So they were just like taking things that they had. The easiest thing for them to take was the housing of the earlier carbon microphone. And so this is actually the housing of a carbon microphone, but the element inside is the condenser element. And then similar to a modern condenser microphone, the electronics are inside just under the capsule.
This still functions. In fact, we can't really show it right now because this is all kind of, you don't just flip on a switch like you would your interface or your preamp at home now, but American Epic is a documentary that it featured Jack White and a number of other artists where you actually set up this gear and you hear what's being recorded. So if you're interested in checking that out, I'll leave a link to where you can find that in the description below. In each case, it's just one track, so to speak. Mm-hmm. So we've got the sound that enters this acoustically, the sound that gets transduced acoustically into electric signal. So the idea of recording and mixing later was not a thing. You had to basically set up people at different distances, pointing different directions, listen to what it sounded like, and then say, that's great, stay exactly where you are, and get a perfect take.
Yeah. And it's actually a very tricky microphone because the closest microphone is probably something like an M50, the Neumann. So it's an omnidirectional microphone, but directional at higher frequencies. And so even moving, between here and here, if you're close to the microphone, makes a dramatic impact on the sound, even though it's omni, because the higher frequencies are directional.
What were the main differences then, moving from here to here in the terms of flexibility and sound quality?
Yeah, so the biggest issue with this approach is it just always has to be loud, essentially, because you're acoustically having to move the diaphragm, and so things like bands and opera singers, anything that can get loud is good. But it's really not an option to record like a subtle blues guitar or like a subtle voice. It's not really an option. So either they would choose the music to fit that, or someone who played a certain way would have to change how they would play, to get it on the wax okay. Next, the response is limited. So the high frequency response, is largely limited by how stiff that diaphragm is and how large the diaphragm is, and the low frequency by how large the opening is on the horn. So you might use a horn like this for a vocal, and then for a band, you might use a bigger horn for better low frequency response. But it's still nothing to what you can do with a microphone electric recording.
In Pro Tools now, or whatever DAW you're using, you record, play it, you press the space bar back, and then press again to know if it sounded good or not. What did that process look like here to record and listen to see if the mix is correct?
So one of the reasons why recording was really the domain of big studios back then is because of this process, because they were recording on wax. So they had to cast the wax, shave it perfectly flat, do the recording, and then as soon as you played that wax back, it would instantly destroy it. And so the only option would be to kind of roughly test what was going on on a junk wax, and then hope that that's also going to happen the next take on your master wax. So you can't check your master any other way than just kind of inspecting the grooves to make sure there's no overcutting or problems like that. Like the big studios, I guess they would get like dailies in a sense. You know, they would get the pressing the next day and then check it then. But at that point the musicians are gone, and so yeah.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it wasn't exactly like this, but in today's terms, if you were used to doing it in Pro Tools, that'd be like letting it roll. It's just a magic take, and then you play it back, and you're like, all right, guys, the mix sounds great. Unfortunately, I just destroyed it by listening to it, so do a perfect take again,
Exactly,
right?
yeah. Yeah, and I mean, even though it sounds crude and impossible, you know, that sort of pressure and energy of the take, you know, often will pull out you know, great performances from musicians as well, in my experience, is because, you know, they see that a mistake, you know, they see me throwing away a disc, you know, and so there's that kind of added anxiety and excitement about it. And so oftentimes, you know, it can really make a great performance just because they're excited about it too.
I want to get into the signal flow of this. So this is pretty basic. You're seeing the whole signal flow here.
Right.
Acoustics enter this. They're amplified, I guess, by the horn, and then they cause a physical movement of the, what do you call it, stylus or cutting?
Yeah, the stylus, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So it goes into the cutting head, will hold the diaphragm, and then attached to the diaphragm is the stylus.
Cool. And then, like you said, that required a lot of acoustic power on this end to yield any sort of usable signal on that end. This changed that. Not only this, but all of this as well.
Yeah, so they would get the microphone, the cutting head, and then this rack. So this is kind of the beginning of our industry. This is the first electric recording rack, so the first ever microphone preamplifier, the first line amplifier, the first level meter, and the first monitor amplifier. And so it was so important and influential, you know, a lot of things that we take for granted today, you know, come from this original rack from 1925. So rack spacing, the size of racks, patch bays, the whole idea of you know, balanced cables, grounding schemes, it all comes from this original design. So it was, Bell Labs was essentially the phone company at the time, and so they kind of repurposed. So these were originally racks for the phone company, and so a lot of these amplifiers were also used for boosting long distance calls and for radio and things like that. The equipment was so expensive to make, it was only leased at the time, and so every record sold, they had to pay a small amount to AT&T and Western Electric.
This is really cool stuff, but that's not why you have it. As we were talking earlier, you don't just collect this to have it here in your studio. There's actually really important reason that you've collected and assembled these things, and there's an important reason that they're all still functioning. Can you tell us about that?
So I'm mostly involved doing sound preservation and restoration. You know, the way things were recorded back then, you know, was very poorly documented. And most of the equipment has been lost over time. And so the only way to really know how to properly extract that now is to understand exactly how it's recorded. So kind of the curves of the microphone and the recording curves of the equipment, and how to kind of reverse that properly to get it to play back right. So the goal of the equipment here is usually to get it all working, and then to really put some test signals through, as well as have musicians play to fully understand the impact of the equipment on what we hear on the records or the tapes.
And you've been doing that since, you said, mid-90s.
Yeah,
when you really
it's been a while.
got started. For me, it's so cool because what you're doing, this is awesome to geek out about, but in restoring some things, I mean, these are moments in our history, and that's the part that I find most moving to me, is that I always thought that something that was recorded with this stuff just sounded terrible, but in reality, this stuff was really quite capable.
Oh yeah.
And you can hear that when you watch American Epic. I was like, is this like some sort of like Pro Tools session on the side, or you know? I was confused. But then, yeah, I mean, the signal's there. You just have to understand the effect that the equipment, the recording medium, the aging of those things had on that signal, and basically invert that and bring it back to life.
The real sound quality hit is often the shellac so the final pressing of the material. So their master metal parts and master wax, they can sound fantastic, and it's often the extra noise from the pressings that can make things really sound poor back then. But even in this section of equipment, it was often like little tweaks that changed over the years, So this is the same condenser microphone technology we use today, but they realize, well, we need to move the diaphragm closer so there's no resonance in the cavity, and these little small changes that really helped over the years. And then even in the rack, there's pieces of this rack like the line amplifier that are essentially contemporary. They have this amplifier has a response from 30 hertz to 30 kilohertz. There were other amplifiers like the mic input amplifier where they were really trying to push the gain a bit too much, and so it does kind of roll a little bit on the sides. But a lot of what they were doing sounded great.
I can't even myself fathom, but the part that I do fathom, I can't express it enough how important the transition from this to this actually was. Culturally, it defined music that we listen to still today. And that's
essentially it's the beginning of early like blues recordings and pop recordings. They're kind of like the crooner voice, close to the microphone, soft singing, and like subtle guitar, acoustic guitar. All that's just not really possible in the acoustic method.
And it existed back when this was the solution to record, but it just wasn't replayed. It wasn't played back. And
you can only hear it live.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that was then a very regional genre. Whereas once we got it on a recording, that genre and those sounds were distributed throughout. I'm getting chills talking about it. It's really, really cool.
Yeah, and that was a fun day. That's what I can't reiterate enough is that these styles of music were played across the world, but that was in a time where you could really only hear, especially those subtle, quiet styles of music, if you were in person with them, because it was just before we got the ability to use a condenser microphone through a rack of amplifiers. We weren't really able to capture a meaningful signal that would allow distribution of those genres. This is something I learned from American Epic, which I mentioned. That's the documentary that Willie Nelson and Jack White and Nicholas Berg and several others, even the singer of Brittany Howard, the singer of Alabama Shakes, you can hear those artists recorded with that exact equipment that Nicholas has. So if you're interested, there's a QR code up here. It'll take you to, I think Amazon has it. I couldn't find it for streaming, so I had to actually buy the Blu-ray disc, but I've watched it a few times, and you get the sessions with these modern contemporary artists recording through this actual first condenser microphone onto a wax disc. And what I found, as I mentioned in the video, it actually sounds remarkably good. A lot of what we think of as sounding bad of these old recordings is really just the aging of the recording itself, as Nick mentioned in the video. Let me pose a question here, though. Doing the opposite. So you can go get American Epic and watch modern contemporary artists recorded through vintage gear. But if you could choose one artist from the pre-electric era and re-record them with modern microphones, who would it be? Whether you're watching this live or on the replay, I'm interested to hear. I see Robert Johnson, Mozart, Chopin, nice. These are the ones I lean more toward. Like, Robert Johnson, I think, was recorded with this equipment, if I have my history correct. But it was certainly in the early days. And then these essential composers, dating way, way back in time, I think it would be incredible to use modern equipment, or even the electric equipment we just watched the story of. I think it'd be great to get recordings of these orchestras that used to play those pieces of music. I think it would sound a lot different than what we hear today. due to all of the different idiosyncrasies of tuning and how everything has changed over time. So yeah, leave your comment below, letting me know who you would record. I think that American Epic disc is available, and I think that's a really, it ties in that idea of not only the technological advancement, but how that technological advancement helped shape our culture. So I'll take that QR code down now, but you can still find the link in the description below if you're interested in learning more. So we then had the ability to record things that were pretty quiet. And though we had a wider frequency range once we started recording in this way, and we had a better signal to noise ratio, and it was more consistent and higher fidelity, it was still not without its limitations, right? And so I think this next pivotal moment where we went from just being able to record a condenser microphone to a wax disc into being able to record and play back from magnetic tape, that was a huge deal. And I think that one opened up a lot of doors, as you'll see in this next clip I'm about to show you. But let me set the stage. Before, people in the military and doing field recording and dictation, and there were some uses of steel wire where they would, it's similar to the concept of magnetic tape, where they could record these magnetic patterns onto steel wire and play those back. But that was so bad, as you'll see in this next clip, that actually the wax discs were still more prominent, particularly in the United States. Meanwhile, though, in the 1930s, German engineers had identified a way to make magnetic tape with plastic coated with, it's iron oxide. You'll actually see Nicholas Berg has one of these first magnetophone units. And that was a huge leap forward. They figured out a concept of AC biasing, which is still a little bit over my head from the technical perspective, but my understanding is that it was likely discovered due to a basically noise that was able to get to the tape. And they found that even using a very high frequency to bias the tape ahead of the recording head, they were able to get a much, much better sound. And there's also some just logistical benefits of using tape compared to steel wire. First off, steel wire is pretty hard to work with over long distances especially, whereas tape, as you know, can be stored in a relatively efficient manner. And also, they're able to be longer because of that. And the playback time was just so much greater than what anyone had heard in the United States, especially at that quality. The United States and any of the Allied forces were just shocked at the fidelity and playback time that was possible. Let's watch this clip, and then we'll get into some of the effects that came from the ability to record to magnetic tape versus wax cylinder. Before we get there, though, I do want to do justice to the wax cylinder itself, because I'm sorry, not wax cylinder, the wax disc technology itself, because you can't edit a wax disc, first off. And that's one of the main developments that we achieved with magnetic tape. But let's put ourselves into the mindset of somebody recording with one microphone going to one wax disc. I think that this is something that seems really, really outdated, but at the same time, you can still use that limitation, that limited scenario that all recording engineers were put in at that time, one microphone and several sources. You can still use that to shape how you record things today. Because let's think of like a drum kit as an example. It's still something that we record several elements with one receiver, one microphone. If you have a stereo pair and an ensemble in front, you can't really turn up the vocal or turn up the bass, but you can move the vocal closer or move the bass closer and move the drums further away. So I think before we move on to the next step, I think it's important to learn from those limitations, and perhaps you can actually set yourself up with similar limitations using modern equipment. And I think you'll walk away from that with more understanding of how to record with more intention. So that's my challenge for you, would be to set up a stereo pair and record a band of acoustic instruments if you can. And don't put close mics on anything, just as an exercise, right? Move the instruments in the room to achieve more reverb or to achieve a closer sound, a louder sound. If you're using directional microphones, maybe you put things off axis to color them in some way tonally. It's just a helpful exercise that you can then take what you learned there and apply it to mic placement on anything, right? So really learning to use a microphone. Man Network says, I've done this with an Omni mic. I'm glad to hear that. Back when I was in audio school, I remember I was kind of fascinated by that idea. And, you know, when you're recording to something really high noise level, every time you layer it on top, the noise builds and builds and builds. So what I was thinking is, what if we took that concept of putting one microphone in front of an ensemble, but because our noise levels with digital are so low, what if we actually recorded each instrument separately so that we still had that control? So I actually put up a mid-side, I think it was a U87, actually probably a pair of U87s in mid-side, and recorded the vocalist, who was close, and then I recorded the piano, and then I recorded the drums, and etc. And I just layered those stereo recordings on top of one another. And, you know, it was a project from a student, so it wouldn't be the work that I would put forward as like the best thing I've ever done, but I did learn a lot doing that. So I encourage you to experiment in a similar way. Sorry for getting off topic. I should have said that stuff ahead of me explaining this magnetic tape phenomenon, but let's go ahead and get into the clip with Nick Berg, where he shows some of the first magnetic tape machines and why they were so impactful.
Wow. Hey, we're here in Burbank, California at Endpoint Audio. I'm with Nicholas Berg. This place is like a museum. In fact, in the last video, we talked about the electrification of recording technology, the first electric microphone and all of that stuff. So you can check that video out with the link in the description below. But another pivotal moment in audio is the transition to magnetic tape, which happened a lot earlier than most people think, but we'll get to more of that in a moment. Can you help us understand first how magnetic tape functions on a basic level?
Magnetic recording was figured out quite early. It was first applied to wire. So this is a steel wire, a bit thicker than a human hair, and on the spool is maybe a mile or so of wire. And so this was even in the acoustic era. They had figured this out in the early 1900s, but they still hadn't there was no reliable microphone or amplifier to use with it, and so it wasn't very practical. For a short time, it was used for like answering machine recording and things like that from phone lines. It just kind of sat there and didn't get developed further. But the basic technology is to vary the magnetic fields from north to south poles, and so it ends up looking like almost like bars, and you can expose via the track. So the recorded track is essentially invisible to the eye. It's not like a record where you can actually see the groove or anything. If you look at the tape itself, it just looks blank. And so the only way to know that it's recorded is to develop the track or use these little viewers. So you can see it ends up looking like light and dark lines, and those are the magnetic fields being shown.
And that correlates then to an audio signal in that the bars are areas of high density, like pressure, I guess, high pressure and low pressure.
So frequency is essentially how quickly it's changing between the two fields, and then level is how strong the field is on the tape. So this technology was applied to wire, but also to a tape. So the Germans developed tape recording in the mid-1930s, and this is an example of an early magnetophone tape machine. This one's from the late 30s, but the early tape machines were still fairly poor quality. And so even though the Americans were aware of the tape machine, it was demonstrated here in the mid-30s, the disc recording was still so much better that no one gave it much mind at the time.
What was the difference between the tape that the Americans had heard and the tape that eventually sounded much better than those wax recordings?
So two things changed. So one, the tape formulation got a little better since they heard it, but the most important thing was the addition of AC bias. So by adding a high frequency to the recording head, it will make the tape recording a lot more linear with lower distortion and lower noise. So that was essentially, I think in all instances, it was discovered on accident, you know, from like a radio frequency on a bench. It got into electronics accidentally, and all of a sudden, like, wow, this sounds incredible. What happened, you know? And so it was simultaneously discovered in Germany, in America, and it was applied to wire in America. It was discovered also at Bell Labs, and they were developing a not tape, but like a steel band, a thin steel band recording. And so it was discovered there, and then also in Japan. So kind of, you know, simultaneously everyone discovered it. But the tape machine was the most effective device. And so the addition to the addition of the bias to the tape really kind of pushed it forward as a great recording media.
Tell us that story you shared with me about the discovery of that by the Americans and the Allied forces. You had some photographs of the original machine.
So this is one of the original machines discovered during the war. It started its life as a DC bias machine, and then during the war converted to AC bias. And this is this is the report on the Allies did when they discovered these machines. It was very confusing to them. Because they were already aware of tape recording and that sort of work, but they didn't kind of understand the fidelity that they were hearing over the radio waves until they started to kind of take these things apart. They realized this small change that happened. So one of the people who brought a machine back was Jack Mullen. So he essentially, you know, took a machine like this apart and stuck it in a suitcase and brought it back. And so he used it initially to do some Bing Crosby recordings and such, because Bing didn't like recording to discs because he wanted to be able to edit and things like that. But eventually, Jack Mullen also helped the Ampex company get into tape making. And so this is the first of the Ampex tape machines that was used professionally.
And you actually have some tape on there that's from the 40s.
Yeah, so this is a vintage tape that we were just looking at. So it's interesting, you know, they were using this German tape machine as a guide, essentially. And so they copied a number of things that they saw. Some were great and some not so great. So one of the things they copied was the B-wind heads. So essentially the tape is backwards to any modern tape machine. So instead of the oxide facing away from you, it faces towards you. And the big problem with this is it's hard to make edits because it's hard to mark the tape. So you have to mark it in back of the head through a little viewing hole here. So they copied the wind type, and then also the idea of the flanges and things like that. But eventually, the B-wind's a very awkward approach to be able to do editing that they sent an upgrade out. So then they just switched all these machines to A-wind, just plop this there instead. Yeah.
So now you can see what you're doing as you're marking an edit.
Exactly,
I see.
Yeah, and I think initially, when these were developed, they were mostly doing long programs, and so they weren't thinking, a lot of the fast edits and that sort of thing that eventually was intended to do.
Well, and that's one of the reasons why this is one of the most pivotal moments. So we were able to record much more subtle signals with the electrification in the last video, but you still weren't able to edit anything. In fact, if you were to rewind and play back something on a wax cylinder, you would instantly destroy it. Over here, you're able to rewind, play it back, but you're also able to cut out sections, splice sections together, which opened up a whole new way to capture and eventually to create down the road.
Right, right. Yeah, so they were doing editing almost from the get-go. So here's an example of a mono head. It's a very simple early head. You can see the coils on each side, and then here's the gap in the middle. But eventually, just added thinner heads and stacked them on top of each other, and that gives you multi-track recording. So first stereo 2-track, and then 3-track half-inch, and then 4-track and 8-track, and yeah. It was a much easier means of doing multi-track, essentially because it's on the same tape. You can edit all the tracks together, and it's simple that way. So this is a vintage tape on here, and the old tapes ran at 30 inches per second. And because the heads were so crude, the gap was kind of wide, it had to run that fast. But eventually they improved the heads, and they went down to it at 15 IPS, so they get more time on a reel.
Can you play us a
Yeah,
clip?
yeah, let's see how this goes. Takes a while to get started.
That sounds remarkably good for how old it is.
Yeah, I mean, this was a very expensive machine. I forget the exact amount, but I think it was like $5,000 in 1948, which is probably a small house at the time. And so it was really it's all Longevin transformers and very sophisticated. Uses big spooling motors and a big drive motor, and so they really went all out on this machine. So the next machine, the 300 that came out shortly after, was smaller and a lot less expensive. And so that's really, so along with being able to edit and the beginnings of multi-track and all these things, the other big thing it did was to kind of democratize sound recording in a way, because before this it was all disc recording, and making wax and shaving wax and all these things require a big studio, and so it's really hard to do it on a small scale. But all of a sudden, if you have a tape machine and a microphone, almost that's all you need at that point. And so things really started to change in the 1950s. That's where you kind of the beginning of the Audio Engineering Society, the beginning of periodicals where you can read about sound recording. It kind of exploded at that point.
Yeah, and it obviously, you're able to edit. That really impacted the way music was made, the way any sort of media was made. You're able to layer tracks, which now at this point, with the third pivotal moment of the DAW in digital editing, that's gone even to a higher limit. But the idea that you can record one part, add on another part, change that other part, mute some things, listen to things in isolation, that's all changed the way music is created. And obviously with that third pivotal moment, the digitalization of it all, that even further democratized the recording. So I wanted to point out that while it is really, really cool that you've got this stuff here, and we always geek out when we look at it, that's not the primary reason why you've acquired this stuff. Because you, as a restoration and preservation engineer, you actually have a very important use for these things.
Yes, I'm always trying to backwards engineer exactly how things are recorded at the time, so I can better extract the audio now. So for example, on these early tapes, the recording curve they use is very different than the curve we use now. And so just being able to recreate that and kind of, figure it out, everything kind of falls into place, playing back these old recordings. And even just understanding the workflow at the time and how they recorded directly to the tapes and that sort of thing, helps being able to locate tapes and the right source and that sort of thing. So all this equipment is really kind of a research collection in a way to improve modern playback of these old recordings.
Yeah, and that sort of foreshadows to the next pivotal moment that we're going to get to, the DAW. But let's take a moment to put ourselves as modern engineers into the people's shoes at that time. Going from a wax disc where you basically cut a groove into it, and that is what it is. Going from that to being able to record to tape, which could be cut, and you could cut a section out and bridge them together, that introduced the idea that's very common today of editing. I'm curious to know whether you're watching this live or on the replay, have you ever recorded using a reel-to-reel magnetic tape recorder? And also maybe let us know, do you still use that? I saw as we were watching that video that Man Network said, we still have a tape machine in the studio, but it only gets used when people are willing to spend about double the studio price for their project. And we're going to get into that as we discuss this next pivotal moment. But you also said that sometimes you print drums through it before going to Pro Tools. And I think that's something that is important. When we transitioned to the tape machine, there were some benefits that were cutting edge. And then we've transitioned to an even more reliable low noise digital audio workstation. But there are still some benefits of going to tape maybe before. So you maintain low noise and low distortion in the digital realm, but going over to the analog realm here and there can add in some of that magic. That's a topic that I discuss a lot in my saturation videos if you're interested in learning more about that. So I know that when I posted this video, I got a lot of comments about how Nicholas talks about how he basically talks about it from an Allied perspective, speaking in World War II, where the Allied forces would confiscate and discover these tape machines that they had never seen before. A lot of that stuff is, I did some deeper diving. It looks like steel wire recording was invented in about 1898. Poulsen is the last name of that person. And then the German leap forward was AEG and IG Farben, the magnetophone that we talked about in that last clip, 1930s. And as I mentioned before, we played that clip. That was primarily the AC bias and the tape construction, the tape chemistry that helped us achieve fidelity and editability that had never been conceived before. Post-war, there was another engineer, John Herbert Orr, who, like Jack Mullen, played part in transferring the technology to the U.S. and launching tape industries and really making an industry in terms of music with the help of Bing Crosby and helping matriculate the technology into entertainment industries. So those are important names that were left out of that original video. Nick is an expert. We were just having a conversation. So I thought in this summary of that video, it would be helpful to mention some of those other people who played a part. And I would encourage you to go look at the history yourself. There are some good AES papers that I looked into and researching for this live stream. And I would recommend those to you as well if you're interested in that sort of thing. Some others in the comments had mentioned other actors like Les Paul, for example. Someone who helped us go from funneling all of these different channels into a single tape track to running multiple tape machines at the same time like they did in film, or Les Paul using sound on sound, where you could actually record a pass and then go back and record a pass, and that really comes across in the music of Les Paul's early use of it, because you can hear those harmonies of the same singer singing over and over on top of one another. So there are other innovators in this history. I'm trying to focus, though, on these three pivotal moments when we went from the acoustic horn, basically, printing to wax, and we started using a condenser microphone. Allowed us to record much subtler things. Then we went from recording with microphones to wax into recording onto magnetic tape, and that opened up the entire concept of editing, and eventually opened up the opportunity to have multiple tracks. You saw Nick in that video discussed how you can have just one head that would record one track, but then you can use two heads and you can record two, and that would allow you to have control on the playback of the vocal versus the guitar, for example. And then you add to 4 tracks, into 8 tracks, into 12 and 24 and 48 tracks. And this is really what started to create a lot more flexibility in probably not only the music recording process, but the music arranging and the music production and writing process. Because now musicians were able to think outside the box. They don't have to record everything all at once. They can actually record, the same musician could record on top of the existing tracks and build something that wasn't possible with previous technology. So I think that's going to get us into this final section, which is when we went from tape to the DAW. And we currently use DAWs today, obviously, as you know, if you're watching this channel. There are other innovators, though, that are worth at least researching on your own if you're unaware of it. So in the 70s and 80s, digital multitrack tape was used. There's Sony PCM, and Dolby played into that. And you also have pioneers using MIDI and other standards that helped shape where we are today. Of course, Pro Tools, DigiDesign's Pro Tools was the first really prominent DAW. And then since then, we've got Pro Tools by Avid, and we've got Logic, and Cubase, Ableton, Reaper, all of these different DAWs. Obviously, the editing capabilities in the DAW are much, much more powerful. In the early days, you were limited to fewer tracks, but as technology has advanced, the most tracks I've used on a tape machine is 24 or 48 tracks. In a DAW session, you can have pretty much as many tracks as you can imagine a use for. And you can actually use more tracks than are even useful if you really want to. You can also, though, undo, right? So as we go from the magnetic tape to the DAW, it's not only that you can edit sections, but you can actually edit sections of given tracks, whereas with tape, you could do that in punching in and recording over the content on a particular track. You may have made a mistake back then, but with a DAW, you can actually cut individual tracks, as you know, and edit them similar to how you would edit tape, but you can always just press Command Z or Control Z and undo, right? So that's a huge deal. There's obviously also a much different situation in terms of recall of your session settings. So in the early days of the DAW, there's probably a lot of outboard gear still being used, and that was, but those were slowly and almost now completely, for many, replaced by plugins. And if you think about that for a second, when you open up a DAW session, you may take for granted the fact that all of your settings are already in place. But before plugins and DAWs, you would have had to reset everything, normal everything back to its default setting, each time you switch sessions, and hope that you had written down the details of how to get that mix back and so that you could put it together and work on it iteratively. I think that's something that I just take for granted because, in school I recorded to tape and I played back tape and I edited tape, but I didn't really do it like the people who worked in the industry for decades, where that was the only way you could do it, right? I did it more as an educational exercise. And so it's easy for me, and I think a lot of others who only know modern technology, to sort of forget how lucky we are to have this. We can make bolder risks. We can take risks without actually risking anything at all. We can always just undo something. We can always bypass a plugin. We can always move plugins around very, very easily. We can duplicate tracks. We can do all sorts of things that were not possible in those early days. Not to mention the fact that with the DAW and digital recording altogether, you've got such a lower noise floor than you did with tape. With tape, there was always an audible noise floor that you were competing with, and you could drive the tape machine harder with higher signal to make the ratio between the signal and the noise as great as possible. But on the upper end, you're getting into harmonic distortion as you approach the upper limits of that tape. So as we know today, that's a popular technique to approach those upper limits, but we can do it when we want, and we're not always living in the confines. Now our noise floor is extremely low, and our distortion is 0 until we approach the actual limit of 0 dB full scale in a DAW. So I'm interested to know if anybody here worked in the industry during that time where tape machines were the only option, before DAWs were prominent. And then I'm also interested if anyone has a tape machine that they still use today, and how do you use it? There's also an option to get a plugin that emulates a tape machine so that we can keep the noise extremely low still, but model those harmonic distortions that occur when you saturate the tape. Let me know in the comments if you use a tape machine and how, or if you were one of the lucky people who had to use a tape machine for a while. And do you prefer tape, or would you ever go back to using tape? In fact, let me put a question in the comments for you. I'm really curious to see the answers to this. If you had to make an entire album on tape today, what would be the biggest challenge for you? Do you rely heavily on editing in your process? And would you even be able to do the productions that you do today on tape machine? Recall, do you like to give yourself breaks and switch between projects? Or would you be able to leave your studio as is or take meticulous notes? And obviously, cost is one of the biggest factors. I think as one of the viewers, Man Network, earlier said, yeah, we can do this, we can record with tape, but only if the client's worth spending about double what it would cost to record digitally. A lot of us, especially if you're recording professionally and you're charging by the hour, and you've got to work on a number of projects to make your living, recording to tape is just completely impractical. But I think for others, it could be used as an inspiration, right? So I'm interested to see what people think in here. You think buying a tape machine would be the hurdle for you, ArcOS says. Right, and especially if you want the extreme grit that comes with a tape machine, you might be able to get a cheaper one. But even that, it's hard to find one in the world today, much less a really expensive, nice tape machine. Here's Man Network says, I'd track the album and still edit in Pro Tools. I wouldn't do the entire mixing and editing on it. It's a really good point for those of you who may not understand what he means, you wouldn't necessarily have to do the entire process. You could still track to tape to get that tonality and warmth, but then you could print all of those through a multi-track interface into a DAW and use plugins and use editing and use the undo button as you can only do in the digital realm. So thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, comping on tape, right? The idea that today we can go back and get 50 different versions of a vocal take. You could only do that if you had 50 tracks available on the tape. Otherwise, you would have to re-record over what you'd already done. There's a really cool video if you search Beatles Sgt. Pepper's 4-track tape breakdown. You'd probably find it, but it helps you understand what is on each of the 4 different tracks and how the Beatles were able to pair things. Let's say pairing a guitar and a bass on one track or on 2 different tracks and then summing them to one track. So now they had 3 remaining tracks and they could record 2 things and then sum those to the second track and so on. And so they were able to not only have one instrument on each track, but have groups of instruments, preferably groups of instruments that you could still somewhat control independently with EQ and things. And the reason that happened and that innovation occurred was because there was no other way to do it, right? And so this is a recurring theme that I always come to when I'm thinking about recording history, is how can we utilize the limitations we have today to create innovations, right? We have fewer limitations in recording today than we ever have. And that's a good thing. I mean, don't get me wrong. But at the same time, from an educational perspective, it's good to have limitations sometimes. So I encourage you to think, how could I learn something by placing the limitations of the past on me today? As I mentioned in the first section, maybe you use an Omni microphone or a stereo pair of microphones, and you record an ensemble by not only placing the instruments in different places, but as Arco S said, by utilizing the musicianship of the performers themselves to balance and create a mix with microphone placement and dynamics. For the second example of moving from wax to magnetic tape, in those days you only had a certain number of tracks to work with. So how could you limit the number of tracks you have to make something under pressure in a way? Because I think pressure can sometimes create opportunities for more creativity. And then today we have the DAW, but I wonder, how can you think about utilizing outboard gear and knowing that maybe you record something on the way in. One of our members here, Mac, is with us, and he experimented with recording acoustic guitar through a compressor into the DAW. It causes you to have to make decisions up front, and it causes you to have to think about the outcome and what you're trying to do so that you actually start with the end in mind. I think a lot of us who have only recorded and mixed with DAWs, we think, I can always change it later on. But I think it's actually helpful to put limits on yourself and say, what do I want this to sound like at the end? And what can I do now to work toward that goal? Rather than saying, I'm just going to record everything and think about how it should sound later, right? If you know what the mix should sound like in your head at the very end of the process, maybe you move the microphone to get a little bit thinner sound on the recording rather than getting a muddy sound that you can use EQ to fix later, right? So yeah, if you had to make an entire album today, what would be the biggest challenge for you? What parts of these technologies do you lean most on in your production workflow? Let's see if we have any answers here. Looks like a lot of good help in the chat. I love that. I think we have a really good culture going on. Thank you, ArcOS, for answering some questions, and others who are answering other community members' questions. Let me know if you like this format too. My plan is to do this every month, where I can come up here and explore a little bit deeper and more interactively some topics that I've explored in past videos. I'm just reading through these comments right here to see if we have anything good. We have a lot of good conversation. Yeah, so it looks like a lot of people would struggle with not having the undo button. I think that would be, I think even if you don't think that you'd miss it, I think once you got into it, you'd miss it. I think there's also, though, something to be said for learning how these things worked, not only to challenge yourself, but it's also a really great way to think of signal flow. An example would be, when I was in college, we would record to tape and learn the idiosyncrasies of that. And then we would record to just a digital recorder where you're going through a console and you're going 2 tracks and you sort of see how everything's patched. And then eventually you move on to layering things on top of one another, and to even doing like soft patching in a live situation. Like a live console is a great way to learn because it's very laid out there in front of you. As we get into more and more advanced digital technologies, there are workarounds for things which are great in terms of the flexibility of the system, but they also, it's harder to learn with those systems because it's not as straightforward, right? There's more flexibility. I think it's actually better to learn on something where there's less flexibility so that you don't feel too overwhelmed by the options at first. Oh yeah, here we go. As for tape per se, no thanks. All the hassle, tape price, maintenance, hiss. I use a DAW as a tape anyway. Sound effects of tape, you might do that. It says you can dial in the head bump and the high frequency compression in the hardware later. Yeah, I think that's, for a tape machine particularly, when you use a tape emulation plugin, you no longer have the noise that comes along with tape. You no longer have, unless you want it, the time, like, what would you call it? I don't even remember the word they used to use. It's not jitter, but it's like a warble sort of thing, where the tape may not necessarily run at the perfect speed. When you use the plugins, you can sort of get the best of both worlds in a way. So yeah, I'm with you there. I think somebody like Willie Green, he still uses tape machines to really get that hiss, though. So I think over the years we have developed an ear for the music that's been created with these more dated pieces of hardware. Yeah, wow and Flutter. Thank you, by the way. We've grown an ear for these things like wow and Flutter. That is something that you hear in like Mac DeMarco's music now, right? Or you get some of this hiss and grit from Overdrive, which is something you hear in Willie Green's music now. So I think it's really cool to look at how the limitations of the equipment we used to use over the years has informed our brains, and it's actually become nostalgic, right? To the point where having a nearly perfect digital recording system as we do today, where there's almost no noise, there's no distortion unless you're using it to get distortion, or unless you're using it incorrectly. We have the very few limitations, so we actually pull upon those older technologies to add some life or nostalgic taste to the music we make today. So much so that we actually create, I mean, I don't, but really smart people create plugins and digital emulations of those things. So it's not always that the most technically perfect thing is the best thing. My opinion is that for playback, digital pretty much wins every single time because it can provide extremely low distortion, extremely low noise playback. But during the production process, I think that there's really something to be said for distortion, and maybe something to be said for some noise or some wow and flutter, to just create movement and richness that you won't get unless you specifically tell digital to do something. You won't get that, right? So in a way, these older technologies have become almost like shortcuts to getting these sounds. Yeah, this is a good way of saying it, Mac. When was the era of sterile music? I hear about it from time to time. Any examples? Some people still think of digital as sterile, and in a way it is still sterile. I think, though, when people say the era of sterile music, they're talking about the early days where digital converters, analog to digital converters, and DA converters were imperfect in a way that they actually, I think, sounded like shrill and unnatural. I couldn't pinpoint that exactly because since I've been in this industry, digital has been amazing. But I think that still today you could describe digital as sterile. But the thing is, when you're playing something back, you kind of want it to be sterile in that you want it to be transparent. At least I do. So if an engineer spent a bunch of time using different plugins and perhaps even different pieces of outboard gear and different tape machines to make a sound the way it is on an album, I don't want my gear to add more warmth or harmonic distortion to that. I don't want my gear to add more noise. I want to hear it as the engineer intended. So in a way, for me, the sterility or the transparency that you can get from digital is actually a good thing. I did a video with Cranbourne Audio. If you search analog versus digital audio university, you might find it. We talked about their preamps, and this isn't really a analog to digital sort of thing, but it does highlight the idea that this Camden 500, it's got a very, very, very clean operating mode, and then it's got a dirty or color or vibe operating mode, because sometimes you want really, really clean, transparent. It records what goes through it and nothing else. And sometimes you want to use it as a tool, the preamp, to actually create harmonic distortion and make the signal something different after it passes through it. The same can be said for tape versus a modern analog to digital converter. A modern analog to digital converter is probably going to try its best to be as transparent as possible. What goes in is what gets printed, and then what is printed is what comes out from the digital to analog converter. And that's really good in most cases. But then there is still something to be said about using a tape machine because of its imperfections. So it's sort of, this may be a hot take, but for me, I think there's no question that for playback, digital is better, right? I choose not to use that word. It's higher fidelity. It just is. What goes in is going to be a lot closer, or what comes out is going to be a lot closer to went into a digital system than like a vinyl record, for example. Now, better is a tricky term because you may want some additional warmth, and that's fine. Better is a completely subjective thing. But in terms of fidelity, sometimes we want that. Usually we want that. And it's actually nice that today we can choose to use a different tool when we don't want that, right? Our default tool gives us maximum fidelity, minimum noise, minimum distortion. And I think that's a good thing. Yeah, that's exactly what Man Network's saying. Yes, I want the playback to represent 100% accurately to what's actually there. Digital wins for sure. Couldn't have said it better myself. And you want that until you don't, right? And that's why you have the tape machine in your studio. So thank you for that perspective. Yeah, so just a quick recap. we went from the acoustic to electric era, where microphones and amplification were able to provide more fidelity and allowed us to record subtler things, right? And we went from wax to tape, where editing was now available, longer playtime, and even better quality was possible. And then finally, we went from tape to the DAW world, in the digital realm, where now we've got basically unlimited flexibility, instant recall of settings, and integration with everything, where we can now pick and choose what we use on a budget even, because instead of having to have a multi-$1,000 tape machine, you can get a plug-in that's really, really amazing for less than $100, you know? So I think there are some things that we see through these progressions where Nicholas Berg had mentioned the democratization of production that occurred when we went from wax to magnetic tape. And obviously that has happened again and again as we've continued to create more technologies. More people can participate in the production world, and they can be artists in this industry. I want to open the door really quickly here, maybe for about, I don't know, 8 minutes. I've got a meeting coming up, but do you have any questions? If you're an Audio University member, I dropped a link in the chat where you can join us on stage here to ask a question face to face. But what questions do you have? Whether you're watching this live or if you're watching it sometime in the future on the replay, I'm interested to talk to Audio University members who want to come up here on stage with me, or anybody on YouTube if you just want to leave a text question. I'd be happy to discuss these topics further. I appreciate you stopping by, though, no matter what. I hope you've enjoyed this. Yeah, so which lav mic kit did I use in the recording of that documentary? That was a DJI mic, I think. It wasn't mine. I actually hired a friend of mine to do the production on that video, and I believe we were using DJI clip-on lav mics for that. So actually, it worked out pretty well, even though those aren't state-of-the-art or anything in terms of microphone quality. I think it sounded perfect, and those are pretty affordable too. So I would highly recommend those. Any other questions? Again, I'll throw out some of those resources we discussed. American Epic, here's a QR code up here, or you can find a link in the description below. That's the documentary where you can hear those first condenser microphone recordings on modern artists. So check that out. If you're interested in testing your audio skills, go take the Audio University exam. We've updated it now so that it will not only tell you what you got right and wrong, but as you go through the exam, it will tell you why what you said is right or wrong. So in that way, we can stay true to the educational soul of Audio University and help you learn along the process. And it's also fun because then at the end, you can brag if you get a good score, or you can get a bad score and know what to work on. And then also I want to mention, we've got several members here in the chat. We've got Mac, ArcoS, and others. You can become a member to get one-on-one coaching with me, with our course instructor, Gabe Herman. We've got the full Mixing Essentials course. Mac, ArcoS, if you want to leave a chat or a comment below what you think about that stuff. You guys are some of our best members in terms of engagement. So thank you for joining this live stream as well, and I hope you're enjoying the membership. Let me show people what to expect in the membership. You get in here and we have the feed where obviously I let you know when we're doing live streams like this, but also we've got members posting helpful videos. We have 2 mix reviews a month where we actually review submissions from our members. And we get Gabe Herman, who has 25 years experience mixing professionally, but also 20 years experience teaching audio professionally. He gives feedback on these mixes. We've got Ask a Professor section where you can ask Gabe something, and if he doesn't know the answer, we'll actually call a different audio professor around the world or the country and get an answer for you. So this is a project we've been working on for about a year now, and I'm really happy with where it's gone. The idea being that instead of YouTube, where it's just content, a word that I'm kind of getting sick of, to be honest, with our membership, you can get theory in the form of content, but then you can also put that theory into practice, get feedback on your work, and also you have access to a community. At the end of the day, that might be the most important thing, because if you're living in a remote area, or even just like I'm here in a medium-sized city, and I only know a few people who really get music production, who really care about talking about different audio stuff. But we've got 300 members who are interested in that stuff, and our community's growing. So join our community using the QR code or the link below if you're interested. Let's see if we have any questions here after my rambling. Yeah, not really. No questions. So I think I'll go ahead and just call it then. Thank you for joining. And if you have questions, leave them below on the replay, and I'll try to get to those. If not, I'll see you next time.